A man on a train gives a young girl a simple gold coin. The next day, she realizes he was the missing billionaire. She thought it was just a random act of kindness, a stranger on a late-night train handing her an old gold coin. But when she looks up his face the next day, she discovers the shocking truth. He was the billionaire who vanished years ago. Why did he give her the coin? And what secret had kept him hidden all this time? Before we begin, tell us in the comments. If a stranger handed you something valuable and disappeared, would you try to find out who they were? And if you love intriguing, mysterious stories, don't forget to like this video to support the channel. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. She hurried down the station platform, backpack bouncing against her shoulders, breath coming in quick bursts as she tried to catch the last train of the night. The schedule board had flashed a small delay, which gave her just enough time to sprint from her evening shift at the cafe across two busy streets, weaving between late commuters and vendors closing up shop. The station smelled of stale coffee and old steel, the echoes of announcements fading as people filtered into different trains. She slowed as she found the correct platform, relieved that the train was still there, doors open. This was her only way home. She had neither a car nor the money for a taxi. If she missed it, she'd be stuck sleeping on a bench until sunrise. She made it just as a final tone chimed, stepping inside the nearly empty car with a grateful sigh. She was 19, juggling a part-time job to support her younger brother after their parents' accident. Life had not been easy these past 2 years, but she was determined to keep going, no matter how exhausted she felt. Her name was Cassie Rivera. She wore jeans and a faded hoodie emblazoned with the cafe's logo, her curly brown hair tied back in a loose ponytail. Glancing around, she saw only a handful of passengers. Most looked half asleep. Finding an empty seat near the middle, she dropped into it, pulling her backpack onto her lap. The old train lurched as it began moving, the lights overhead humming with a slight flicker. Tired from her shift, she reached for a book from her bag. Some old paperback that a friend had lent her. Before she could open it, she noticed a figure near the far corner of the car. A man slumped in the seat, wearing clothes that looked rumpled, as though he'd been in them for days. It was easy to mistake him for a homeless traveler at first glance. The fabric of his coat was dusty around the sleeves, and his shoes were scuffed. He had a hood pulled partially over his head, concealing much of his face in shadow. The overhead light flickered, and for a moment, Cassie thought she saw him shiver. She flipped open her book, telling herself to mind her own business. But something about the man's posture tugged at her empathy. The exhaustion and worry etched into his slumped shoulders reminded her of how she felt most nights. She turned a page, glancing again in his direction. He raised his head, and their eyes locked briefly. His gaze was intense, haunted, with a quiet sorrow that startled her. She managed a small, hesitant smile, which he didn't return, but at least he didn't look away immediately. She blinked, gave a slight nod, then lowered her eyes. A few more stops passed. Barely anyone boarded or left. She noticed the man glance out the window with a restless air, as though he couldn't decide if he should stay or bolt. She wondered if he was simply anxious or if he was on the run from something. She told herself to stay calm. It wasn't her business. She tried reading her book again, and for a few minutes, the rattling of the tracks lulled her into a half-doze, worn out by the day's shift. When she opened her eyes, she realized the train had paused longer than usual. A mechanical voice announced a delay due to a minor track issue. A few passengers groaned in annoyance. Cassie stifled a yawn, noticing that the man in the hood seemed to be breathing unevenly. She couldn't help but watch him for a moment. Then, acting on impulse, she pulled a small bottle of water from her backpack, rose from her seat, and walked toward him. She saw him stiffen in surprise when she stopped in front of him. "Do you want some water?" she asked softly. He hesitated, studying her face as though trying to gauge her intentions. With a slight tremor, he reached out, accepting the bottle, giving a muted nod of thanks. He drank sparingly, then handed it back, voice so low she almost didn't hear him. "Thank you." She gave him a small smile, returned to her seat, and attempted to read again. though she couldn't help feeling curious about him. The train continued its erratic progress, stalling at a couple more points. Commuters mumbled about how this late-night route was always glitchy. Cassie tried to keep her eyes on her pages, but every so often, she glanced at the hooded man. She thought she saw him trembling slightly under his coat. Maybe it was the cold or a fever. The lights overhead flickered more strongly, then returned to normal. At last, the train lurched into motion for a solid stretch, rolling through empty stations. Cassie was close to dozing off when she heard footsteps approach her. She startled, realizing the hooded man stood at her aisle seat. He didn't speak right away, but she saw him holding something in his hand. A small coin that glinted under the fluorescent glow. She looked up, and he hesitated, his eyes flicking left and right as though wary of watchers. Then he extended his hand. "You gave me water," he said in a hushed tone. "Please, take this." She frowned, trying to wave off any reward, but he gently pressed the object into her hand. A gold coin, heavier than she expected, about the size of a typical old-fashioned currency piece. She tried to refuse. "I can't accept," she began, but he shook his head, stepping back. "It's not about money," he whispered. "Keep it safe for me. Let it remind you that a small kindness can matter." He looked as if he wanted to say more, but the train screeched to a halt at the next station. Doors hissed open. He turned abruptly, moving through the crowd toward the exit. She tried to call after him, but people swarmed around, half asleep, half in a hurry. By the time she managed to slip off her seat, he was gone, leaving her with that strange gold coin in her hand. The train's doors slid shut, the car jerked forward, and she had no choice but to return to her seat, and perplexed by the encounter. When the train finally reached her stop, she trudged home, exhausted, still clutching that coin. In the dim light of her tiny apartment, she examined it. The metal looked genuine. Engraved on one side was a crest she didn't recognize, along with letters in a language she couldn't read. On the other side were the initials NG. She felt a stirring of curiosity. Perhaps it was some collector's item, or maybe just a trinket with no real value. She placed it in a small wooden box where she kept a few sentimental items, shrugged off the oddness, and went to sleep. She assumed she'd never see that hooded man again, though a faint worry nagged at her, wondering if he was safe. The next day, she woke up early, sore from the late shift, but needing to buy groceries before her next job as an office temp. She had a short break midday and liked to check the news on her battered phone, scanning headlines while waiting in line at the store. And that was where she saw it. Billionaire heir Nathaniel Green missing for a week. Family launches nationwide search. She read the article, seeing a photograph of a neatly dressed, confident man with short dark hair, described as the inheritor of a vast corporate empire. According to the article, he had vanished from his estate days after his father's funeral, leaving no clues. Some suspected foul play, others hinted he'd run off to grieve privately. The family offered a substantial reward for information about his whereabouts. She scrolled through the details, mind wandering, until her eyes snagged on a reference to a unique family crest that had been minted on special coins for the Green dynasty. The text said these rare coins bore the initials NG. She froze. That matched her coin's design. Her heart pounded as she recalled the hooded man's haunted eyes on the train. Could that have been Nathaniel Green in disguise? At first, she dismissed it as an impossible coincidence, but the more she thought about it, the more the details lined up. He had that gold coin, marked with NG. He acted jumpy, like a man on the run. The news described him as reclusive, dealing with hidden family tensions. She felt a spark of alarm and excitement. If the man on the train really was this missing billionaire, he might be in danger or injured, or possibly he'd chosen to vanish for reasons unknown. She wondered if she should contact the authorities or the Green family's hotline. Yet she only had a single coin as evidence, not exactly proof he was the same person. She hesitated, biting her lip. She read the family's official statement about wanting him found safe, worried that maybe turning in an innocent man might be misguided if he was indeed fleeing for good reason. But if he was in trouble, doing nothing might be worse. Eventually she decided to call the tip line. She had nothing to lose, except maybe facing ridicule if it was all a misunderstanding. The operator listened, sounding busy, and Cassie explained she encountered a man who might be Nathaniel Green, disguised on a late-night train. She mentioned the gold coin. The operator sighed, saying they had many tips, and asked for more details. Cassie gave a description. Tall, possibly dark-haired though he wore a hood, gave her a coin with NG on it. The operator thanked her, said they'd file the tip, then hung up quickly. Cassie felt uncertain. She suspected her tip might be drowned out among others. Unsure what else to do, she tucked the coin into her pocket, telling herself to watch the news for updates. 3 days passed. No progress reported on the Green case. She tried not to dwell on it, busying herself with her 2 part-time jobs. Still, a sense of responsibility nagged at her. The man had singled her out with that gesture of giving the coin. Why do that, unless he wanted her to link him to the NG initials? She recalled his trembling hands, how he seemed both relieved and sad when he gave it to her. As if the coin was a final cry for help, or a promise that someone decent might hold on to a piece of his identity. She decided to look more deeply. She began asking around near the train station, showing the coin's crest to a few folks who were known to help the homeless or run night shelters. She described the man's approximate height, the quiet timbre of his voice. People shook their heads mostly, though one older security guard recalled a man matching that description, wandering the station late at night, looking over his shoulder. He'd vanished after a few days. Cassie asked if he said anything about where he was heading. The guard only shrugged, saying the man never spoke. Dead end again. She found herself feeling worried for his safety, imagining what would drive a billionaire to hide among train passengers late at night. Was he threatened by someone? The news had speculated about corporate power struggles or a family dispute. She felt a flicker of fear for him, a man she barely knew yet felt responsible for, simply because he gave her a gold coin. One night she rode the same late train, hoping to see him again. She carried a water bottle, a snack, and that coin in her jacket, prepared to approach him if he appeared. But the train was nearly empty, no sign of the hooded figure. She repeated that routine for a few more nights, skipping precious sleep, but found no trace. Some part of her began suspecting he'd left the city, or even that he'd met with foul play. She recalled how fragile he seemed. She debated letting the matter go. The coin was still in her possession, the only link to that perplexing encounter. On the 5th night, she was about to give up when she recognized a group of homeless individuals near the station, rummaging through trash bins. She approached them gently, describing the man, showing them the coin. One person, a gaunt woman, said she might have seen a man like that lurking near an abandoned warehouse down by the old harbor. Cassie's heart skipped. She tried gleaning more details, but the woman only muttered about seeing him once, limping away. That was all Cassie had. She decided to check it out the next day, her day off from both jobs. She half expected it to be a wild goose chase. The next morning, she took a bus across town to the Old Harbor District, a place rumored to be a hideout for squatters and drifters. She felt uneasy walking among half-collapsed warehouses, the air thick with rust and decay. Broken windows gaped like empty eyes, graffiti scrawls covering battered walls. She clutched the coin in her pocket for courage. She explored carefully, calling out softly. The stench of stale water and rotting debris filled her nose. For a moment she thought it a foolish venture, until she heard faint coughing in one of the warehouses. She followed the sound, pushing aside a warped door, stepping into dim, dusty gloom. Sunlight slanted through cracks in the walls. There, slumped against a pillar, was a man with a hood pulled over his face, trembling. Her heart pounded as she realized it looked exactly like the man from the train, same stance, same battered coat. She called out quietly, "Hello? Are you the one who gave me this coin?" She held it up, letting a shaft of light reflect off its surface. He looked up, eyes dull with fever, and she recognized the haunting gaze. Yes, it was him. He tried to stand, but his legs wobbled. She ran forward, catching him by the arm. Up close, she saw features that matched the photos of Nathaniel Green in the news, though his face was gaunt and unshaven, his hair grown out. She swallowed, voice shaking. You're "You're Nathaniel Green, aren't you?" His mouth opened, then closed. Eventually he nodded, tears gathering. She helped him settle onto a makeshift crate, rummaging in her backpack for a bottle of water, offering it to him again. He drank gratefully, wincing as though in pain. He admitted in a ragged whisper that he'd been hiding here for days. She felt a swirl of emotions: shock, relief, worry. She demanded to know why he was running. He explained in halting words that he had discovered a conspiracy within his father's corporation soon after the funeral. Certain board members, possibly even relatives, wanted him out of the picture to seize control. He suspected they might try to kill him or paint him as mentally unfit. Fearing he had no one to trust, he fled, discarding phones and credit cards. He roamed the city, staying on late-night trains, seeking anonymity. She realized then that his giving her the coin was a desperate hope that someone kind might figure out his identity, or at least keep a part of him safe. He apologized for dragging her into his mess, though she quickly reassured him he wasn't dragging her anywhere. She was there by choice, wanting to help. Seeing how feverish he was, Cassie insisted they go somewhere safer than this drafty, decaying warehouse. He shook his head. He was convinced that the conspirators had watchers in many places: hotels, hospitals, anywhere big enough to track him. She argued he couldn't remain half dead in a warehouse. Eventually they compromised on a modest motel out on the outskirts, one that took cash and asked few questions. She guided him, half supporting his weight, out of the building, then hailed a cheap rideshare, telling the driver that he was just a sick friend who needed rest. The driver gave them a skeptical glance, but said nothing once Cassie paid. Nathaniel collapsed against her shoulder in the back seat, drifting in and out of consciousness. They reached the motel, paying for a dingy room with flickering lights and stale carpets. She settled him on the single bed, buying some basic medication at a nearby drugstore. Over the next 2 days, she nursed his fever, applying cool compresses, feeding him soup from a convenience store. Whenever he felt coherent, he explained more about the corporate sabotage he suspected. Bank accounts manipulated, certain relatives forging documents to prove he was incompetent. She asked if he couldn't just contact the police, but he said he feared some might be bribed, or maybe he was paranoid, but better safe than captured. She realized the scale of what he was dealing with was massive. She found it surreal how a young man with billions at his disposal was stuck in a no-name motel, relying on a broke cafe worker for survival. During his bouts of delirium, he sometimes mumbled about his father's death, the regrets of not mending old rifts, the pressure to manage an empire alone. Cassie listened in sorrow, seeing a man who was not an aloof billionaire, but a frightened, grieving son, burdened with a corporate machine that wanted to swallow him. She tried to keep him hydrated, using what meager resources she had. On the second day, he woke more lucid, apologizing for making her skip work to care for him. She shrugged it off, saying she had a flexible schedule and a supportive coworker covering. She told him she felt responsible ever since that night on the train, recalling how alone he looked. He offered her a wry smile, admitting that giving her the coin was a gamble, but one that saved his life, it seemed. He realized they needed a better plan than hiding indefinitely. She suggested verifying some of his suspicions with actual evidence: paper trails, documents. He nodded, saying he had stashed certain crucial files in a secret apartment downtown. If they could retrieve them, they might approach a lawyer or a trusted figure in the government to expose the conspirators. Cassie found it all nerve-wracking, but she agreed. She was in too deep to back out now, especially since she had him in front of her, obviously in need of someone trustworthy. He made a call from a burner phone, or tried, but seemed uncertain which contacts he could trust. In the end, they decided to do it themselves. On the third night, they slipped out of the motel under the cover of darkness, taking another rideshare to a nondescript building in a part of the city Cassie had never visited. Inside a small, cluttered apartment on the 5th floor, she found a trove of old corporate documents stuffed in boxes. Nathaniel said he had stored them after suspecting foul play. Reading them in the dim overhead light, Cassie's eyes widened at references to large unauthorized transfers, suspicious sign-offs that contradicted the official board minutes. It looked like a nest of corporate fraud, leading back to certain powerful figures in the Green Empire. She realized that with these, Nathaniel could prove wrongdoing, possibly convict them if he reemerged publicly. But the risk was huge. The conspirators might be scouring the city for him. If they found out he had these documents, they'd intensify efforts to silence him. The plan became clearer. Gather the documents, hide them somewhere safe, then contact a reputable attorney or law enforcement official known to be beyond the conspirators' reach. Cassie suggested a friend of a friend who worked in the state capitol's legal department. Nathaniel weighed it, acknowledging they needed someone outside local circles. They spent the next day sorting the files, scanning the essential ones with a cheap second-hand scanner Cassie borrowed from an office she once temped at. They needed digital backups in case the physical documents were seized or destroyed. All the while, Cassie felt an odd closeness forming with him. They joked occasionally about the ridiculousness of scanning documents in a rundown apartment, about how a billionaire heir was rummaging dusty boxes in a hoodie. In quieter moments, they shared glimpses of their personal struggles, from Cassie's story of losing her parents to a car accident, leaving her to raise her younger brother, to Nathaniel's story of inheriting an empire he never felt prepared for. She realized how lonely he was, how little genuine warmth he had in his life. She told him how that single gold coin had given her hope that he was not just a cold figure, but someone seeking a spark of kindness. He seemed touched, admitting that coin was minted by his father as a limited run, ironically meant to be gifts for loyal associates. He had kept one coin hidden, a token of his own father's complicated legacy. After 2 nights of frantic scanning and organizing, they had enough evidence compiled to make a case. Now they had to deliver it to a safe contact. Nathaniel picked a name from Cassie's suggestions, a senior state official, rumored to be honest. They planned to drive to the capital at dawn, but the night before they left, a chilling event occurred. Rummaging outside the apartment door, footsteps, a muffled voice. Nathaniel went pale, shutting off the lights. Cassie peered through the peephole, spotting men in dark suits, scanning the corridor. She stifled a gasp. Perhaps the conspirators had tracked him here. They waited in tense silence as the men eventually moved on. Her heart hammered. They needed to flee immediately. Gathering the scanned files on a flash drive, plus the original documents in a sealed bag, they slipped out the fire escape, stealthily navigating a back alley. She felt the adrenaline surge, reminding herself that if these men caught them, the result could be dire. They managed to get to Cassie's battered old car that she borrowed from a friend, tossing the documents inside. With no time to lose, they drove all night to the capital, about 3 hours away. Nathaniel dozed in the passenger seat, occasionally jolting awake in fear. Cassie kept the radio off, focusing on the road, glancing at him with concern. The city lights gave way to rolling darkness, then eventually the glow of the capital's outskirts as sunrise neared. She navigated the early morning traffic, feeling an odd sense of triumph. 2 weeks ago, she was just a tired cafe worker struggling to support her brother. Now, she was helping a missing billionaire expose corporate corruption. They parked near a quiet government building. Nathaniel used his father's old connections to schedule a discreet meeting with an official in a secure office. The official, a stern woman named Delgado, spent hours listening to their story, scanning the files and confirming their authenticity. Delgado's brows furrowed as she grasped the extent of the conspiracy. Certain board members, a cousin, possibly even a senator, had been orchestrating a takeover. Delgado assured them she would mobilize the appropriate agencies to protect Nathaniel and freeze the conspirators' assets. Cassie nearly sank to the floor in relief. Nathaniel, too, exhaled as though a crushing weight lifted from his shoulders. Delgado recommended a safe location for Nathaniel until the investigation advanced. She also suggested a press statement eventually, to show he was alive and well, preventing any more rumors of him being unfit or absent. That afternoon, they settled into a government-arranged safe house. Cassie found it surreal, stepping into a plain apartment with minimal furniture, protected by federal guards outside. But at least now they had assurance that some part of the law was on their side. They ate a simple meal, exhausted from the nonstop tension. Nathaniel looked at Cassie across the small table, voice trembling with gratitude. He told her he owed her everything, that if not for her compassion on the train, he might have vanished entirely, or ended up in an even worse situation. She blushed, brushing it off, saying anyone with a heart would have done it. But inside, she felt a rush of warmth at his sincerity. Over the next week, Delgado's department moved swiftly. Arrests were made among certain board members. Freeze orders were placed on suspicious accounts. News outlets lit up with the revelation that Nathaniel Green had re-emerged, having discovered an internal conspiracy. The initial shock gave way to public fascination. The missing heir had apparently hidden among common folks, eventually surfacing with evidence that might rock the corporation's power structure. However, Delgado advised Nathaniel not to appear publicly right away, to avoid possible retaliation. So he stayed in the safe house, Cassie by his side, continuing to sort additional files. The night train story leaked out in rumors, but no official statement confirmed it. Cassie avoided interviews. She felt that their story was personal, not a spectacle. Their time in the safe house brought them closer. Daily contact forging a bond that transcended any difference in wealth or status. She discovered that behind the veneer of a wealthy name, Nathaniel was kind but burdened by the old family legacy. He discovered that behind her modest means, Cassie possessed a resilience born of personal tragedy. In quiet moments, they laughed over small jokes, cooked makeshift dinners in the cramped kitchen, and sometimes reminisced about how a single gold coin changed their fates. The coin itself stayed in Cassie's pocket or next to her bed, a tangible link to how they first connected. Eventually, Delgado's team declared it safe enough for Nathaniel to hold a press conference in a secure setting. They recommended he confirm he was alive, present the basics of the conspiracy, and reassure the shareholders that he intended to lead the corporation forward with integrity. He invited Cassie to attend, but she felt shy about the media glare. He insisted she stand with him, as she was the reason he managed to survive and gather the evidence. She hesitated, worried about being thrust into the spotlight, but recognized the symbolic power in being there. So, on a bright morning, in a guarded government building, Nathaniel Green faced the cameras for the first time in weeks. The media buzzed with excitement, flashbulbs popping. He spoke calmly about betrayal within the corporation, how he fled to protect himself until he could compile proof. He thanked an unnamed Good Samaritan who sheltered him, saving his life. At the end of his statement, he gestured to Cassie, who stepped forward, heart-pounding, blinking at the flashes. He introduced her simply as the friend who showed him kindness on a train. The crowd erupted in speculation. She felt heat in her cheeks, but a sense of pride as well. Days turned into weeks, and the conspirators faced charges, some indicted on fraud or attempted embezzlement. Freed from immediate threats, Nathaniel could resume normalcy, or as normal as possible, given the scandal. He took a suite in a secure hotel while the corporation reorganized. He invited Cassie to stay if she felt comfortable, though she declined, preferring to keep her modest apartment at first. She had to care for her younger brother, who was confused but excited that she'd been helping a billionaire. Meanwhile, local news tried to track her down for interviews, but she avoided them, not wanting to be exploited for a headline. She continued her part-time jobs, though she noticed how the stress had changed her. She realized she might want more from life than scraping by. One evening, Nathaniel asked her to dinner. They found a quiet restaurant away from paparazzi. Over the course of a simple meal, he told her how he planned to reorient the corporation to be more transparent, to fund philanthropic efforts, and to create scholarships. He had glimpsed how easily power could corrupt people, especially those around him. She admired his resolve, seeing how the vulnerability of being missing had taught him empathy. He then gently inquired about her future, encouraging her to think bigger than temp jobs. She admitted she wanted to finish her studies. Perhaps, with a scholarship or some assistance, she could do so. He hinted that he'd be happy to sponsor her, though she insisted on not receiving direct financial gifts. He respected that boundary, but said he could recommend her for a corporate position if she ever wanted. She felt touched by the offer. Their relationship blossomed into a genuine friendship. He found solace in her grounded perspective. She found inspiration in his new sense of purpose. She realized that though they came from vastly different worlds, the hardships each endured, her losing parents, him losing trust in his own circle, fostered a deep understanding. Over time, the spark of closeness ignited into mutual affection. They began dating in a more conventional sense, going to movie nights or strolling a public park in disguised caps to avoid recognition. She teased him about once living incognito on the trains, while he teased her about how she was more fearless than half his old board members. One day, as they walked by the river, he presented her with the same gold coin she had safeguarded. She was puzzled, reminding him she still had it in her drawer. He clarified that this was another coin, minted from the same special run, and asked if she would keep it as a personal token of their journey. She laughed, saying now she had two identical coins, but accepted it as a sign of trust. He then, trembling slightly, dropped to one knee, producing a small ring from his coat. He said that her unwavering kindness from the moment she offered him water on the train to the nights they risked everything scanning documents had redefined his view of humanity and love. He asked if she would marry him, not out of any forced arrangement, but from genuine choice and affection. Tears sprang to her eyes. She recalled how unlikely this all seemed, how just weeks ago she was a tired cafe worker and he was a missing billionaire. Yet the bond they'd formed was real, tested in crisis. She said yes, pulling him up into a tearful embrace. They wed in a modest ceremony a few months later. Her brother served as ring-bearer, her co-worker as a witness. He wore a simple suit, she wore a tasteful gown someone from the corporation offered to design. Nathaniel insisted the event be closed to the media, wanting sincerity over spectacle. Under the arch of a small chapel's courtyard, they exchanged vows that rang with heartfelt truth about kindness forging unbreakable connections. She slipped a ring on his finger, remembering how once, on a bleak train ride, she'd simply offered a stranger some water. He recalled the heaviness in his soul then, how he never believed one coin could spark the rescue he needed. The guests, few in number, wept or smiled to see a union born of an improbable meeting. In the aftermath, the corporation thrived under new leadership. The conspirators faced justice, new executives rose who shared Nathaniel's philanthropic outlook. Cassie eventually went back to college, finishing her degree part-time, with Nathaniel cheering her on. She continued living by her principle of compassion, while he used his resources to expand charitable programs. The press, for a while, buzzed about the romantic story of the heir who disappeared and the working girl who found him. Over time, the noise died down, replaced by quiet admiration for their down-to-earth approach to life. Sometimes at home, they'd examine the gold coin that started it all. She'd turn it in her hands, tracing the crest and the initials NG. He'd recall how hopeless he felt that night, stepping onto a train with only a few personal items, certain he'd be hunted. He gave away the coin with a silent plea that if the stranger who received it was truly kind, they might unravel the clues. They'd share a smile, acknowledging how fate worked in mysterious ways. She'd say it wasn't fate, but a simple act of kindness that forged a path forward. He'd nod, pulling her close, grateful for the second chance at life. One breezy evening, they stood on a balcony overlooking the city lights, Cassie's arm looped through Nathaniel's. They reminisced about how a small, battered train carriage carried the seeds of a story that no one could have predicted. She told him she still kept the original coin in a safe place, a talisman of empathy. He told her that every day he was reminded that trusting a stranger with that coin was the best decision he ever made. The city below sparkled, but not half as brightly as the hope and gratitude shining in their eyes. Cassie rested her head on his shoulder, recalling the hush of that night train, and the quiet man with haunted eyes who turned out to be so much more. He pressed a kiss to her forehead, feeling an immense sense of wholeness. A year later, the city's main newspaper ran a follow-up article about the philanthropic expansions in the Green Corporation. They described how the once missing heir had revolutionized internal structures, championed new employee welfare programs, and funded scholarship funds that changed hundreds of lives. The article also noted that he had married an ordinary woman from a modest background, proving that bridges between wealth and everyday reality could be built with compassion and authenticity. Photographs showed them smiling at a ribbon-cutting event for a new community center. She wore a simple blouse, a radiant grin, while he, once rumored to be either dead or in hiding, looked content and grounded by her side. In the quiet corners of their home, an apartment only slightly larger than her old place, but far from the grand estate he could have chosen, they managed a life free from the burden of constant media. She continued to work part-time at the cafe, sometimes just to keep grounded, and studied in the evenings while he balanced corporate responsibilities with philanthropic visits. They found time for personal joys, reading on the couch together, strolling through local markets, or riding a train on purpose once in a while, though never the last train at midnight. She teased that she might spot him in a hood again, but they both laughed, too thankful to revisit that terror except as a memory of how far they'd come. Whenever she reflected on the moment that started everything, she realized it was the simplest of acts, noticing someone who looked lost or lonely and offering a small bottle of water. That gesture showed her the difference a person can make with minimal resources. He recalled it too, recalling how in his darkest hour, that kindness convinced him there was still reason to believe in good. The gold coin he gave her stood as a silent testament, each glint on its surface representing hope. And so, in their daily routines, in their quiet expansions of empathy within the corporate giant, in the hush of their late-night conversations, they carried that unspoken vow to never forget how one minor moment of compassion could rewrite the entire story of a life, or two. Sometimes reporters asked them for the definitive version of how they fell in love. They usually brushed it off with a brief mention that he was missing. After she found him, they overcame adversity. The details of the sabotage, the conspirators, the tension in that old warehouse, the scanned documents, and the hush of the safe house, these they guarded for themselves, precious and personal. They felt no need to feed the public appetite for drama. The final lines of each interview inevitably praised them as a fairy tale couple. Cassie would smile, but in private, she and Nathaniel understood it was no fairy tale. It was real, filled with danger, sorrow, raw trust, and above all, a bond that soared from the smallest seed of generosity. And so life went on, with new challenges and joys. They faced expansions, board negotiations, philanthropic expansions, her brother's schooling. But each morning, Cassie woke in a bed warmed by the man who had once been a hooded figure on a train, and felt thankful for their improbable connection. He would wake, smile at her, and they might recall those simpler nights, her a tired barista commuting, him a desperate billionaire on the run, crossing paths in a battered train car. The memories spurred them to keep living with humility and empathy, to never lose sight of how fragile success could be, or how crucial one act of kindness was in forging something extraordinary. Under the beam of a new morning sun, Cassie might occasionally withdraw that gold coin from its box, to trace the crest with her fingertip. Then she'd wrap her arms around Nathaniel, reminding him that everything had changed because of that coin's silent message. He would hold her close, neither regretting a single step of the journey that allowed them to find each other in a world that often seemed too vast for coincidences. The missing billionaire was missing no longer. He had found not just his own sense of identity, but also the love and warmth he never knew he needed. All thanks to a young girl on a train who noticed he was trembling and decided to care. If you like this story, be sure to give it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow. And if you enjoy stories that embraces your heart, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one. Let me know in the comments what stood out to you the most. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.